The barn door creaked open against the frozen dawn, its hinges crying like a throat long unused. A slice of winter light cut through the dark interior, catching dust motes that swirled like restless ghosts. Boaz McKinnon stepped inside, the familiar weight of silence wrapped around him the way it always did. He was a man of early hours, a man whose life was measured in chores, finished before the sun cleared the horizon. His gelding steamed outside in the cold. But Boaz moved slowly, gloves creaking as he tugged them tighter. He had come here for a horse, nothing more. Just a simple trade at Harlan Price's barn, and then the road home. But the quiet wasn't quite right. The dapple gray mare in the first stall shifted uneasily, eyes flicking toward the shadows. The straw crunched faintly under Boaz's boots as he moved past rows of iron gates. That was when he heard it, a sound too soft, too human to belong among hooves and snorts. It was breath. Ragged, uneven, filled with a desperation that had no business in a horse barn. Boaz froze, head turning slowly toward the far stall. He didn't call out. He didn't ask questions. A man who had buried more than one good thing in his life learned that silence often told you more than words ever could. Careful steps carried him to the back, where bales of hay leaned crooked against the wall as if hiding something. He moved one aside, and there, half hidden in shadow, was the shape of a woman. Her wrists were bound with coarse twine cut from a horse rope, the fibers biting raw into her skin. Her face was bruised lips, split one eye, swollen, but when she looked at him, it wasn't with pleading. It was defiance, sharp and steady like a candle flame that refused to be snuffed out. Her cotton dress was torn at the shoulder, her boots gone, ankles scraped and bleeding. Yet her back remained straight, her chin lifted. Boaz felt the barn tighten around them, the smell of straw and cold iron closing in. He hadn't come for this. He hadn't asked for this. But a man doesn't mistake human breath for horse breath, and he doesn't walk away once he's heard it. Boaz had just slipped the last knot loose when the sound of spurs scraped across the floorboards. A voice followed, smooth and smug, the kind that oozed power without ever earning it. "Well, hell." "You're early," McKinnon drawled, Harlan Price stepping into view with a polished coat and boots too shiny for real work. He didn't glance at the woman in the straw. To him, she wasn't a person. She was an inconvenience, an object. "Fine horse in the next stall," Harlan continued, grinning. "Strong shoulders, steady gait. But I'll sweeten the deal. She's part of the sale. Call her a bonus." The words hung heavy in the cold air, filth dressed up as business. Boaz rose to his full height, his hand steady on the woman's arm as the rope slipped to the ground. His voice came low and flat with no heat, no tremor, just truth. "She yours," Harlan chuckled, waving one hand like it was all a joke. "She's in my care, that's all. Runaway liar, nothing worth your trouble. But you want the horse, you take her too. A bargain." Boaz didn't blink. He didn't argue. He turned to the woman, extended his hand not as an order, but as an offer. She hesitated, then pushed herself upright. Her legs wavered, but her spine didn't. Together they walked past Harlan, past the stalls, into the bitter morning air. They didn't take the horse. They didn't take Harlan's bargain. They took the silence, sharp, final, and full of meaning. Outside, the wind cut against them like truth itself. The woman sat in his wagon under a rough wool blanket, her eyes fixed on some far horizon. Boaz said nothing. He didn't need to. His choice had already spoken. The wagon rattled through a curtain of wind and frost until Boaz's cabin came into view, a sturdy outline against the pale hills. No words had passed between them. None were needed. The silence itself felt like a rope pulling them away from the barn and into something neither had chosen, but both somehow recognized. At the cabin, Boaz pushed the door open and lit a lantern. Shadows leapt across rough-hewn beams, catching the corners of a room stripped down to what a man needs to keep living, a hearth, a table, and the discipline to survive the winter. He set kindling to the fire, the strike of flint echoing like a gunshot before flames caught and began their patient climb. The woman lingered near the threshold, still wrapped in the wool blanket, her eyes sweeping every corner. She searched for exits, not comfort. Even the glow of fire seemed a trap. Boaz didn't try to coax her closer. He simply laid bread on the table, poured coffee into a tin cup, and sat down. He didn't ask her name, didn't demand an explanation. He only waited his stillness and answered to every question she was too tired to ask. Finally, hunger overruled suspicion. She ate quickly, but not greedily, each bite carried with the dignity of someone determined not to be broken even in weakness. When she finished, he slid another blanket across the table. Her fingers brushed the wool with hesitation, as if kindness itself might bite. She took it, but she did not lie down. That night, the fire burned steady its crackle, filling the silence where words might have been. She curled on the floor in the corner, refusing the bed, refusing the comfort that seemed too dangerous to trust. Boaz stayed awake by the window, feeding the flames each time they faltered. His eyes tracked the snowfall outside, but his thoughts lingered on the fragile figure wrapped in wool asleep, but not safe, not yet. There were no promises in that first night, only firebread and silence. But sometimes survival begins with nothing more than those three things, and a man willing to keep the fire lit until morning. Morning broke pale, the kind of light that made snow look endless, and mercy seemed scarce. When Boaz stepped outside, he found her curled on the porch bench, blanket wound tight around her knees, as if she had kept herself ready to flee even in sleep. Her bare feet hovered above the boards, never touching down, as if the earth itself could not yet be trusted. He didn't question it. He didn't press. Instead, he held out a tin cup, steam curling upward into the cold. Coffee, nothing more. She took it in both hands but didn't drink. He stood beside her, eyes on the distant hills, saying nothing. The silence again was its own fragile language. By midday, Boaz left bread, eggs, and a basin of water before heading out to mend fences. When he returned, the food was gone, the basin empty, but she was not in the house. He found her in the barn, seated in the same stall where he'd first cut the rope from her wrists. She wasn't hiding, only staring at the dust motes drifting through a shaft of light as though measuring the weight of freedom. Later, the scent of frying eggs filled the cabin. She had cracked two into a pan with bruised but steady hands. She slid a plate before him, then took her place by the window rather than the table, arms folded, as though distance might shield her from kindness. Boaz ate without remark, letting the quiet stretch between them, an unspoken truce as fragile as dawn itself. The cabin carried only the soft crackle of fire and the measured scrape of fork against plate. Outside, snow pressed against the windows like a hand refusing to let the night in. She sat across the room, her shoulders stiff, eyes fixed on the horizon, as if freedom might be hiding there. Boaz didn't push. He never had. He chewed slowly, then set his cup down with a quiet thud. For a long moment, he just watched her hands, the way they trembled faintly, the way they clenched as though still remembering the bite of rope. Then, with a voice low and even, he asked a single question. "Your name?" It wasn't a demand. It was almost an offering laid gently between them, like kindling, waiting for a spark. She didn't answer at once. The silence grew heavy, carrying years of unsaid things, years of being called everything but herself. Her throat worked, her eyes flicked toward the window, and for a moment he thought she might refuse. Then she whispered it, barely more than a breath. "Delaney." The words seemed to fracture the air, not loud but final. It was not explanation, not confession, just identity, thin but unbroken. Her gaze lifted toward him, braced for pity or disbelief. None came. Boaz simply nodded once, as if the name had always been waiting between them. He turned back to his plate, giving her the dignity of silence. And in that quiet, for the first time, she was no longer nameless. The knock came sharp against the cabin door, not timid, not urgent, simply certain. Boaz rose, swung it open, and there stood Ada McCraw. Her shawl was sage green, frayed at the edges, her silver-streaked hair tucked neatly back. In her hands she carried a basket filled with thread and a small sack of sugar gifts wrapped in scrutiny. She stepped inside without waiting for permission, her eyes sweeping the room with the practiced gaze of a woman who had lived long enough to see more than she cared to repeat. The fire popped. Delaney sat near it, her frame still taut like a string too long drawn. "Well," Ida said at last, setting the basket on the table. "Winds turned mean." Boaz nodded steady. "It'll freeze by morning." Her attention shifted back to the woman by the hearth. "She staying long?" The words weren't cruel, but they carried the weight of a town already whispering. Delaney's jaw tightened. She spoke before Boaz could answer. "Just till I figure where next." Ida tilted her head, one brow raised. "Plenty of folk in town figuring the same." "I'm not folk," Delaney said quietly, Her voice clipped sure. No, Ida agreed. But they'll talk like you are. Silence hung thick for a beat, the kind that gathers when truth is spoken plain. Then Ida pulled her shawl tighter, turned toward the door, and left the sugar behind. Not kindness exactly, more a warning wrapped in courtesy. By the time Boaz rode into town, the whispers had already taken root like weeds in frozen soil. The blacksmith looked up too long. The grocer's wife bent her head with feigned innocence. Deputy Bixby leaned on the counter of the mercantile, his tone casual but edged like a blade dulled from overuse. Just making sure she's there on her own, well, the deputy said, eyes narrowed. She is, Boaz replied, flat his voice, leaving no room for doubt. But doubt was exactly what the town thrived on. Harlan Price had been there earlier, loud with indignation, claiming the girl owed him board, that she'd stolen coin as well as refuge. Paperwork, debt, contracts, it all sounded official enough to folks who wanted gossip more than truth. Boaz didn't argue. He gathered his oats, tipped his hat, and left. Back at the ranch, the air was quieter, the kind that lets a man breathe again. Yet what he found pulled at him in another way. Behind the shed, Delaney knelt in the hard dirt, her fingers raw and red in the cold. She pressed small seeds into the soil with a stubborn care, as if the earth might still listen to her, even when people would not. What are you doing? He asked. There were seeds in the pantry, she murmured, eyes fixed downward. Thought maybe come spring, though I don't know where I'll be then. Boaz crouched nearby, not close enough to crowd her. He heard what she didn't say, the doubt, the ache, the refusal to assume she belonged. When she lifted her gaze, tired and wary, he left words behind. Instead, he placed a pair of boots beside her. His boots, worn frayed at the laces but solid. She touched them like they were too much, too generous. Why, she whispered. He stood brushing soil from his hands. Because you'll need them, wherever you go. It wasn't a claim nor a demand, just a gift, an open path. In that moment, the ground between them shifted, not yet a promise, but the start of choice. The firelight glowed warm against the cabin walls, throwing shadows that seemed to breathe with every flicker. Delaney sat by the hearth, her hands hesitant as they hovered over a small wicker basket tucked beneath the shelf. It was filled with thread needles and scraps of fabric, Boaz's late wife's sewing basket. For a moment, she froze, fingers trembling. I can put it back, she murmured, half ashamed, half defiant. Boaz's gaze settled on her, heavy with memory, yet softened by something else. He shook his head once, slow and deliberate. No, she'd like it being used. The words fell like an unlocked door. Delaney lowered her eyes and began stitching each pull of the needle, not just mending cloth, but testing the edges of belonging. Boaz watched in silence, the weight of the past easing just enough to let the present breathe. But the West never let peace linger long. A few days later, Harlan Price rode up the drive, boots too polished for mud, grin slick as oil. He carried folded papers, his voice dripping with authority. Her stepbrother signed these, he declared, thrusting the parchment forward. Labor contract. She's mine until the debt is worked off. Boaz unfolded the papers, his eyes moving slowly over the words. Then, without ceremony, he folded them again and tucked them into his coat pocket. His voice came low, flat as an anvil. She ain't property. For the first time, Harlan's grin cracked. You'll regret it, he spat, before wheeling his horse back toward town. That night the cabin was quiet but not restful. Boaz sat by the fire, the papers heavy in his coat. Delaney lingered by the door, her silhouette outlined by moonlight. When dawn crept pale through the window, she was gone. On the table lay a single scrap of paper, her handwriting small and uneven. Thank you for never asking me to smile. By the time Boaz read the words, her footprints had already vanished into the snow. The storm had grown mean by the third night, ice instead of snow, sleet that rattled on rooftops and bit through wool like a swarm of needles. Boaz sat by the hearth, boots still on hammer idle in his hand. He wasn't waiting, not exactly. He just hadn't found a reason to put away the hope that lingered like smoke after fire. When the knock came, it wasn't timid. It was steady, 3 measured raps that cut through the howl of the wind. Boaz rose, opened the door, and there she was, Delaney. Her hair clung wet to her cheeks, her shoulders quaked beneath the borrowed coat, and her fingers were blue with cold. She didn't plead. She didn't apologize. She only met his eyes with the question unspoken. Would you let me in again? Boaz stepped aside. She crossed the threshold without thanks, dripping onto the floorboards, her jaw tight with defiance that looked too much like exhaustion. He handed her a towel. She didn't smile, didn't soften, just dried her hair with rough, hurried motions, as if to erase the evidence of needing anyone. Later by the fire, she told him in fragments where she had been. Eda McCraw had given her work 2 shirts to mend, no questions, asked, only the silent authority of a woman who had outlasted worse storms than gossip. But Harlan Price had found her on the street. He'd grabbed her arm, hissed through his teeth that she made him look a fool. He warned her she'd never eat in this town without his name stamped on her, unless she could conjure papers proving she was more than the sum of her debts. Her voice was flat when she recounted it, but her hands shook faintly where they rested on the towel. "Did he hurt you?" Boaz asked. She stared into the fire. Not this time. Silence filled the cabin, heavy, but not empty. Boaz poured her a second cup of tea, set it in front of her. She didn't reach for it, not yet. "You're safe here," he said, voice low. Her eyes flicked up sharp with something between anger and grief. "No one's safe, Boaz. Not here. Not anywhere. People are only tolerated until they're gone." The words cut deeper than the storm outside. He didn't argue, didn't offer comfort she hadn't asked for. He only sat back, the fire painting half his face in amber, the other half in shadow. That night, she didn't climb into the bed upstairs. She lay on the floor blanket, wrapped tight the way she had that first night. Not out of fear this time, but out of habit, like a soldier who never quite trusts the silence between battles. Boaz didn't press her. He banked the fire, left the lamp burning low, and sat by the window until the storm dulled to a hiss. Delaney closed her eyes, but she didn't sleep easily. Memories flickered behind her lids, barn doors, slamming ropes, cutting into her wrists, men's voices deciding her fate as if she were livestock. Even in safety, her body remembered danger. She drew the blanket tighter, whispering to herself words she wasn't ready to say aloud. "I want to stop being afraid." Across the room, Boaz sat still, listening to the sleet drum against the shutters. He heard the rhythm of her restless breathing, the soft rustle of fabric as she shifted. He didn't speak. He only stayed solid, unmoving, a presence that neither demanded nor abandoned. Chips of pine scattered, her breath came ragged, her jaw locked tight. Boaz watched from the barn door, arms folded, saying nothing at first. He could see it wasn't the wood she was fighting. It was something older, heavier, the echo of nights when rope bit her wrists, of voices that told her she was nothing, of silences that made her believe it. "You'll wreck your wrists that way," he said, finally stepping closer. "I ain't breaking," she spat, her voice shaking more from rage than exhaustion. "Just burning." She swung again, and the axe slipped, thudding into the frozen ground. Her shoulders curled inward, as if the weight of her own fury had folded her in half. Her voice cracked. "You ever had something done to you so long that even when it stops, you still wake up choking on it?" Boaz didn't flinch. He reached for the axe, steady but not forceful. "Don't swing like someone else's ghost is in your arms," he said quietly. "You've already started letting go." She laughed, then sharp and breathless. Not joy, just the sound of someone realizing the truth might not be impossible. By evening, the cabin carried a new rhythm, pots simmering low, the scent of cornbread rising, the scratch of needle and thread weaving steady through fabric. Delaney moved with quiet purpose, no longer a guest surviving in borrowed space, but a woman carving out a corner of her own. She stirred the stew without asking, set plates, without prompting, her hands sure even as her heart lingered on edges of doubt. Boaz sat nearby, watching without intrusion. His voice came low, almost casual. "You ever think of leaving for good?" She paused, thread pulled taut between her fingers. For a moment, she didn't answer. Then her gaze lifted, steady, fragile, but unflinching. "I thought it every day," she said softly. "Every day, until you untied my hands." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was full, like air after rain, alive, waiting. Boaz only nodded once, his face unreadable, but his eyes softer than the lamplight. Delaney bent back to her stitching, but her breath eased, and for the first time she wondered if home could be built stitch by stitch, meal by meal, silence by silence. The bell above Eda McCraw's shop chimed sharp against the hush of morning. Delaney stepped inside, shoulders squared, her hair pinned back, Boaz's old flannel tucked neatly into a skirt she had hemmed herself. It wasn't fashion that carried her forward. It was the quiet audacity of walking tall after too long bowed. Eyes followed from behind curtains as she crossed town, but she didn't lower her gaze. Not this time. Ida nodded once toward the back. Table's yours. No fuss, no pity, just work waiting. Delaney slipped behind the counter, hands steady on needle and cloth. She sewed with the precision of someone mending more than fabric. Every stitch was a declaration: I exist. I belong. But word traveled faster than stitches. That afternoon, Deputy Bixby darkened the doorway, hat-low ledger tucked under his arm. He lingered, his eyes shifting from Delaney's bent head to Boaz's name spoken beneath his breath. Harlan's pulling the law, in the deputy muttered voice, careful. Says she's property. Labor debt. He's got papers claim signed. Boaz wasn't there, but his presence hung in Bixby's hesitation. They'll ask for proof she was mistreated. Proof she didn't choose it. Delaney's needle paused mid-stitch. The room seemed to hold its breath. Proof. As though the rope burns on her wrists, the bruises fading along her arms weren't evidence enough. As though dignity could be measured in signatures. She looked up finally, her eyes steady, unflinching. What they want isn't truth, she said quietly. It's what they can believe. The deputy tipped his hat uneasy and left. The bell rang again, but softer this time, almost regretful. Delaney bent back over her sewing, each stitch sharper, fiercer, as if weaving armor out of thread. The wind pressed hard against the cabin that night, rattling the shutters like bones shaken in a gambler's hand. Delaney stood on the porch with her shawl clutched, tight eyes fixed on the road that led out of town. Her voice was low when she spoke. I should go. You've carried enough weight without me dragging more on your name. Boaz didn't argue. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out the folded parchment, Harlan's so-called contract, creased and smudged with dirt, but still legible. He held it out, not like evidence, but like a key. I didn't burn it, he said. Figured it wasn't mine to destroy. Her hands trembled as she took it. For a long moment she stared at the words that had once chained her ink strokes, pretending to own her life. Then with a steady breath, she stepped to the hearth. The fire licked eagerly at the edges, crawling inward until the paper curled black and vanished into ash. She watched every line dissolve, every false claim rise in smoke. When the last scrap crumbled, she turned back, her face not smiling, but freer, etched with something like defiance, something closer to peace. Boaz studied her, his arms folded loosely across his chest. Then he spoke slow and sure. You don't have to stay, but if you do, I'll build you a room. Her eyes flickered, caught between disbelief and a fragile hope she hadn't dared name. A room, she asked. He nodded once. Not a corner, not the floor. A place that's yours if you want it. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was alive, like the space between hammer strikes when a new frame is about to rise. And for the first time, Delaney let herself imagine belonging. The fire had burned low, its glow casting restless shadows across the cabin walls. Delaney sat with her knees drawn close, the weight of what she had just done burning those papers still smoldering inside her. Boaz lingered near the doorway, silent, as always, his presence filling the room more than any words could. Her voice came finally, not loud, but edged with a truth she had carried too long. I never asked to be rescued, she whispered, her eyes fixed on the flicker of embers. Then she turned toward him, steady now, though her breath trembled. I only wanted to be remembered. The sentence hung between them, raw and unvarnished, heavier than confession, lighter than prayer. For a moment, Boaz simply watched her, the weight of her words settling into him like nails driven clean through wood. Then without reply, he reached for the hammer resting by the hearth. The sound of iron against oak cracked the silence, and one strike then another. He wasn't fixing anything broken. He was building. Each swing carried no drama, no grand gesture, only certainty. Delaney's eyes followed him, and for the first time she saw not just the rancher who had untied her hands, but a man who intended to carve her name into the very frame of his home. Outside, the winter pressed against the walls. Inside, the rhythm of his hammer beat steady like a vow he didn't need to speak. And she realized being remembered was the beginning of being truly seen. Snow still clung to the rooftops of town, but the streets of Maine bustled with life merchants arranging their wares, women sweeping stoops, children dragging sleds across rutted tracks. Against this ordinary noise, Delaney stepped forward. She wore the red coat Boaz's late wife had left behind, the hem brushing her boots, its color burning like a banner in the pale morning light. The coat didn't quite fit, but it wrapped her shoulders with a quiet defiance. Her stride was deliberate, her chin lifted. For the first time since she'd been dragged from a barn stall, she walked through town not as a shadow but as if she belonged. People noticed, heads turned, curtains twitched, conversations faltered. She didn't rush, didn't glance away. Her very refusal to hide was its own declaration: I will not be erased. Inside Ada McCraw's shop, the bell rang as she entered. Ada looked up from behind the counter, her sharp eyes softening just enough to acknowledge. A nod, a gesture toward the table in the back. You're early, she said. Delaney folded her coat neatly over a chair. Had something to prove. The rhythm of needle and thread soon filled the air, but outside the murmur of voices thickened. A current of unease swept the street, and then the bell above the door jangled again, hard, discordant. Harlan Price strode in boots too polished for the mud outside, his smugness wrapped around him like armor. He didn't wait for invitation. His eyes locked on Delaney, and his mouth curled into something between a sneer and a snarl. There you are, he spat the words loud enough for the shop and half the street beyond. Delaney froze, her needle still poised above the cloth. Ida's hands stilled too, resting on the counter, as if weighing whether to reach for scissors or a hammer. You think you can humiliate me, Harlan barked. Show your face in public, like you don't owe me, like you didn't steal from me. You're still mine, girl. The words hit the room like a whip crack. Delaney rose not quickly but with steady control. She faced him fully. Her voice didn't tremble. I'm not yours, Harlan lunged a step closer, his hand reaching. But before he could touch her, the doorway filled. Boaz McKinnon. His canvas coat was dusted with snow boots still wet from the creek crossing. His presence changed the air itself. No weapons drawn, no raised voice, only the immovable gravity of a man who had already decided the outcome. She told you no, Boaz said evenly, placing himself between Harlan and Delaney. Harlan scoffed loud and ugly. She's a liar. She's free. She's nothing but a stray. You're keeping her like a dog and calling it charity. Boaz didn't blink. His voice stayed calm, dangerous in its simplicity. Then why are you so scared of her walking through town? The shop went still. Outside faces crowded near the windows. This was no longer just between them. It had become a trial, the town its jury. Harlan yanked a crumpled sheet from his coat, shaking it like a weapon. I have signed paper legal claim. Her kin gave her over. She's property till the debt is worked off. The silence was broken not by Boaz, but by another voice. Ada McCraw stepped from behind the counter, her eyes hard as flint. And I saw you drag her into that stall 2 months ago. She had no shoes. You bolted the door from the outside. That's not care, that's captivity, Harlan snarled. Slander. Then sue me. Ada snapped back, her chin lifted. From the doorway of the bakery across the street, another voice joined. Mrs. Norling, apron dusted with flour, pushed her way inside. And I saw you slip an envelope to the deputy. Few dollars more than a horse's worth. You paid him to look the other way. Harlan's face reddened rage, twisting into panic as the tide of voices swelled. He turned, searching for allies in the crowd pressed against the glass. None stepped forward. Not the grocer, not the pastor. Not even the law, because the law was already walking in. The bell rang again, and Deputy Bixby entered, a ledger tucked under his arm, sweat beating at his temple. His voice was careful, formal. I've got new orders. He cleared his throat. County judge reviewed the affidavit. All eyes turned to him. Harlan Price, he said, his tone firmer. Now you're to come with me. The words cracked through the shop like a rifle shot. For once, Harlan's mouth hung open without sound. He looked from face to face, searching for someone, anyone to back him. None did. The crowd outside stood still, their judgment already cast. You're making a mistake, he sputtered. You're all making a mistake. But no one moved. Even the deputy avoided his eyes. At last, Harlan realized what power truly looked like, not the papers in his pocket, but the absence of anyone willing to stand beside him. His shoulders sagged as the deputy guided him toward the door. The bell rang again, final this time, as the man who once claimed ownership of another soul was led away like a criminal. Delaney did not cheer. She did not gloat. She simply stood straighter, her hand still holding the needle and thread. She had paused mid-stitch. Her silence was not submission, it was victory. Boaz glanced at her not with possession but with respect. He hadn't spoken for her. He hadn't needed to. She had stood, and others had stood with her. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and steady, covering the street as if to wash clean the memory of the scene. But in every window and doorway, townsfolk carried away the image of a woman in a red coat walking forward with her head high. Ida returned to her counter, Mrs. Norling back to her bread. Life inched forward, but with a new rhythm, a new understanding. Delaney gathered her coat, folded it neatly, and stepped outside. Boaz followed a pace behind, not as a shield, not as a savior, but as a man walking beside her. The trial hadn't been in a courtroom, but in the court of public gaze. And in that moment the verdict was clear: she was no one's property. She was her own. Snow drifted soft as sifted flour, laying its hush across the wagon rails and rooftops. The crowd had scattered the clamor of judgment, fading into whispers behind closed doors. Delaney and Boaz stood in the stillness, the red coat folded neatly over her arm. The world pared down to breath, silence, and the weight of what had just shifted. She turned to him, her voice low but steady, carrying the tremor of something long unsaid. "Why did you follow me that day? You could have walked on, bought your horse, never looked back." "Why me?" Boaz's gray eyes held hers without flinching. He took a long breath, the kind that belongs to men who choose words as carefully as they build fences. The pause stretched, not empty, but deliberate. At last his voice came low and sure. "Some things don't need a reason," he said. "They only need the right moment." The wind caught her hair, lifting it like a fragile banner. For the first time she didn't drop her gaze. The answer was not poetry, not promise, but it was truth. And truth spoken without demand was more than she had ever been given. The storm had passed, leaving the land softened under a quilt of new snow. From the outside, Boaz's cabin looked the same, smoke curling from the chimney fences, bowed beneath frost. But inside, small things began to speak, quiet declarations louder than any vow. On the washstand, a small tin comb sat beside the basin. Not tucked away in her satchel, not ready for flight, but placed there as if it belonged. By the fire, her boots rested beside his mud, still clinging laces, worn but set side by side like companions. And in the windows, curtains had appeared stitched from scraps of old linen. The seams weren't perfect, but the fabric caught the light, turning the room from shelter into home. Delaney never announced she was staying. She didn't need to. Each act carried its own truth. "I am not leaving yet." Boaz noticed. He saw the comb, the boots, the curtains. He didn't speak of them, didn't point them out, but when he stepped into the barn later that week, he carried a hammer, not a rope. The stall where she had once been bound still smelled of hay and cold iron. He ran his hand along the rough beam, then began pulling it apart. His strikes were steady, purposeful. She found him there, sleeves rolled, sweat misting his collar, even in the chill. "You fixing it for a new horse?" she asked, her voice quiet but edged with curiosity. He paused, turned slowly, eyes unreadable but softened. "No." Her fingers brushed the smooth grain of the new timber he'd fitted. "Then what? Maybe a pantry. Maybe a root cellar. Maybe—" He hesitated, then added, "a cradle. Depends what the house needs next." Delaney's breath caught. She didn't laugh. She didn't protest. But something in her face shifted like thaw beneath snow, an unspoken recognition that the stall was no longer a coffin. It was being remade just as she was. And in the quiet of that barn, between hammer blows and falling dust, a past defined by captivity began to turn into the promise of shelter. The barn smelled of fresh timber and thawing snow sawdust clinging to the air, like the ghost of spring not yet born. Delaney stood with her hand on the beam he had just set, her voice low, almost swallowed by the silence. "Boaz," she whispered, her gaze steady, though her breath wavered. "Can two people build something together? When both are still broken?" The question lingered like smoke, fragile and dangerous. He didn't look away. Instead, he set the hammer down, its echo fading into stillness. "That's the only way it holds," he answered. His voice wasn't poetic, wasn't grand. It was plain as wooden nails, yet it carried the weight of a vow. Delaney's throat tightened. She had braced herself for pity, for promises too smooth to believe. But what he offered was different, an honesty that acknowledged cracks and dared to build anyway. That night in the soft lamplight of the cabin, Delaney moved quietly through the room. She lifted a wedding shawl once belonging to his wife, a fabric kept folded by the window for years, heavy with memory. With careful hands, she tucked it into a drawer. Not to erase the woman who came before, but to make space for the woman who stood there now. Boaz noticed, said nothing. But when he stepped out onto the porch, he left the door open behind him. The gesture was small, but it carried the shape of an invitation. You can follow if you want. This space is yours too. Delaney lingered by the fire, her fingers brushing the grain of the table, the stitches of the curtains she had sewn. And then she stepped outside the cold air, sharp, the moon laying silver over the snow. She stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder, not rescued, not claimed, simply present. And in that stillness, she understood their fractures weren't weaknesses. They were the very seams where a new life could take hold. Moonlight poured across the field, silvering every fence post, every drifting plume of snow. Inside the cabin, the fire hummed low, steady as a heartbeat. Delaney brushed her hair near the hearth, her fingers moving slow, uncertain, as if testing whether she had the right to such simple peace. Boaz sat opposite, elbows on his knees, eyes quiet but deliberate. At last he spoke, not with the distance of a man guarding his silence, but with the gravity of someone placing a cornerstone. If you stayed, he said, I'd only ask for three things. Your name on the deed, your cup on the shelf, and your hand when the nights get long. The words landed with the weight of iron and the tenderness of thread. No demand, no rescue, just a map of belonging traced in the smallest, most human markers of home. Delaney's breath caught. She had lived years without being wanted except as burden or bargain. And here he was asking not for service or beauty, but for presence, something she had always feared was too little to give. Boaz reached under the table, pulled out a folded paper. He slid it across the wood, the crackle of parchment louder than the fire. She unfolded it, eyes widening. The deed, half the land, half the house, signed in his own hand, waiting only for hers. I didn't earn this, she whispered, voice trembling. No one ever does, he replied. That's why it matters. Her hands shook as she folded the paper, placing it beside her plate, as if anchoring herself to the reality of it. That night she took the bed, and Boaz lay on the floor one last time. Not out of distance, but respect for transitions deserved grace. In the morning when she woke, he was beside her, still clothed, boots on but there. And for the first time she did not flinch at the nearness. Because the deed was not just land. It was proof she was no longer temporary. She belonged. The fire burned low, throwing soft halos across the cabin walls. Outside, snow glittered like glass, untouched and infinite. Inside, silence reigned, not empty, but whole, carrying the weight of everything that had already been said. Delaney lay awake, the memory of too many nights spent waiting for rescue pressing against her ribs. Rescue, she realized now, was never the point. Some people aren't meant to be saved in a blaze of glory. They are meant to be held, kept steady, sheltered, allowed to breathe until their own legs remember how to stand. For the first time, she understood that home wasn't just a roof or a bed. It was the rare silence that allowed healing without demand, without judgment. It was the unspoken promise you can stay until you're ready to move on or not move at all. Her gaze drifted to the red coat hanging by the door. Faded, weather-beaten, once a mark of captivity, now it hung as a relic of survival. Proof that she had walked through fire and come out carrying not scars alone, but her name, her dignity intact. And with that, she closed her eyes no longer, a fugitive, simply a woman finally at home.